We've also, Dr. Tim Webster at the Center of Geographic Sciences, I don't know if Tim's present, but he's done some excellent work in mapping salt marsh migration on PEI at select sites, and so we're really hopeful that can be a starting point for even more mapping of these changes that are taking place. One of the things that this new data has allowed us to do is look at individual properties as they come to us as a department. So our department receives applications for development and subdivision in coastal areas all the time. So one of the things that we have done is incorporate into our process of receiving those applications, assessing them individually for coastal erosion risk and flood risk. So anytime an application comes in, it comes across my desk or another staff member to look at that erosion risk. And as far as the erosion risk, we can identify the rate of erosion, which is specifically used because that's what the regulations state. It has to be 60 times that rate. So we provide that. The flood risk is more a matter of practice because we have the data. There is no requirement for us to identify or assess flood risk for these applications, but we're becoming more and more aware of the need to make coastal property owners aware of this risk. The question of liability is more and more on people's minds. In instances where we're approving development in an area where there is flood risk, we want them to be aware of it. So we're looking to protect islanders from these risks, and also from our own perspective, there has been, as part of this discussion, an acknowledgement that when we allow development in high-risk areas, that can put other people at risk as well. If we're allowing development repeatedly in high flood risk areas, for example, storm surge, those people need to be rescued in many cases. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've had with this data. As I said, we have an erosion rate for every meter of shoreline, and we're not specialists in this type of data, but we're really looking to make it useful to people and useful to us as well. So we looked at other jurisdictions and how they're dealing with, how they're using their erosion data, how they're treating it. And some of the things we looked at were these notions of smoothing, blocking, and weighted smoothing. And not to get too deep into the weeds here, but just to show you what I'm talking about, if we have erosion rates for every meter of coastline, it's essentially averaging out the differences. So taking running averages for for each meter, you might take 5 or 6 values on either side, and then using those values to kind of smooth out some of those micro differences. That is used in other jurisdictions. North Carolina here as an example. Blocking is another possibility that we looked at, where we can take these individual erosion rates and sort of categorize them if they fit within a certain range, and once they fit in a certain range, you sort of just assign a one number that would apply to all of them. So again, just sort of averaging out those differences. Another one that we looked at was this notion of weighted smoothing, which is essentially the same thing. You're averaging it out, but applying a greater weight as you get closer to the center value. In the end, we had a lot of conversations, maybe too many, about what to do with this. What we decided on was essentially just taking the average erosion rate for the given property that we're looking at. And so that's worked for us so far. That's and so that's what we're doing on a case-by-case basis. Challenges is just how to communicate this type of risk to people and communities. Our end goal is to make all of it available online, and that's still a work in progress. I mentioned the coastal erosion and flood risk assessments that we're doing for every application that comes in for an individual property. And we may start to look at municipalities and talk to them about providing this information as they process applications for development and subdivision in their jurisdictions. Yeah, all risk assessments advise residents of the increasing threat of climate change. So that's on our mind. Not only what has the risk been, the erosion risk is based on a historical erosion rate. So that's not what the rate is going to be in the future. We believe that the rate will go up. We want to advise residents of that. I mentioned we take the average rate for each individual property. One of the challenges is, in this case, the example I'm showing you here, that's a pretty uniform range of erosion risk in this case. But in other cases, it's not quite so uniform. So you could have an erosion rate, a rate-based setback that's putting a property owner quite far back on his or her lot, whereas his neighbor could end up closer to the water. And you end up with these, not disputes, but why can't I do what he's doing type of conversations with adjacent properties. The data in comparing the 68 and 2010 coastlines really just measured the difference in location. So in this case, I've just shown where the red is there. That's highlighting that area as high risk of erosion, which means that it's just changed at a rate of greater than 90 centimeters a year between 1968 and 2010, where they've delineated the coastline. In this case, that's a salt marsh. So strictly speaking, that's not erosion. It's a receding coastline, likely due to sea level rise. We're trying to find ways about how to communicate that and how to include that in our assessment of risk. At the end of the day, that's still a receding coastline. It's still a threat to the property behind it, but it's another part of the conversation that we're having. I did mention that we include assessment of flood risk for coastal properties. That is for disclosure purposes of the data that we have in our possession, but also to inform developers and property owners about risks that we think they should know about. Unfortunately, the legislation currently does not allow for restriction of development based on flood risk. We can only set back development based on the erosion rate. So technically speaking, we can be permitting subdivision and development in areas that fall into what we consider to have high flood risk. So in conclusion, the new data has been great for islanders. We feel we're able to identify risk better than we were able to before. The erosion rates have changed. That means setbacks have changed, and so neighboring property owners are at times a little antsy. We may have approved a subdivision based on the old rates, and now that they go into the property they want to develop it, the new rates, we're using the new rates, and they have to be set back much further than originally anticipated. As I said before, we can't restrict development currently based on flood risk. And at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of disagreement about how to regulate coastal development. So we're just trying to use the data as best we can, as we see fit, and that's going to be a work in progress about how to use this data, and as we acquire new data, how to integrate that into our processes. So that's all I have for today, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.